just in terms of my background, I come from Toronto, which I know you will all hold that against me, an Easterner, but I first started off in I first started off with philosophy and economics in university, and then I switched over to business and graduated in business and trained for a year and a half as a real estate investment analyst, the only one at North American Life. So we were doing developments out here in Vancouver and in Toronto and a wide range of things, and I'll indicate to you in a little bit why that was important for me. The second thing I did was that at the time, in those years, a lot of stuff was going on in planning. There was a big change in planning taking place. I'll describe that to you on the next slide, but I went back to school, got my master's degree in planning, and became a neighborhood planner for the city of Toronto and one of the managers of neighborhood planning in Toronto. The people that I worked with, surprisingly at the time on that, were Ray Spaxman, who then came out here and became the director of planning for Vancouver. Hugh Kellis, who then came out here and became the head of planning, one of the head of planning for the GVRD, and Ken Cameron. Hugh Kellis was one of the other neighborhood planners, and Ken Cameron I worked for in the province of Ontario as a planner for a short period in when I was going through the university. So a lot of those people came out here because they wanted to be on the West Coast, and they went away from a big city planner type of situation, and that had some appeal to me as well, the big city. I was really, really into the things like the Spadina Expressway, not for it, against it. And you in Vancouver had the same thing happening with your expressway going through Chinatown, Strathcona, and coming into the downtown at the same time, let me say. And urban renewal. And an urban renewal at that time meant high-rises in groups. And there was a change, a radical change in that with the neighborhood planning. So I spent 6 years there in the city of Toronto doing that, and then decided that I was still single, and well, not quite. But let's put it, I ended up still single, and decided that I hadn't seen the world yet. So I took 2 years off, my first retirement, I think of it as being, and traveled around the world and got as far as India and Nepal and Kashmir, places you can't go, some of those places you can't go to now safely. And I got homesick, so I came back to Toronto. And one place I went through, and I had one friend in anyways, was Vancouver. And I thought, Vancouver has got to be the most beautiful place I've ever been in. And so I came out to Vancouver and decided to see if I could stay here. And I applied for the director of planning in West Vancouver, and what I had to offer apparently was what they were looking for, because I didn't go home to basically wait for the response. Bob Collier took me down and introduced me to Terry Lester and to Derek Humphreys, the mayor at the time, and handed me the keys and said, "When can you start?" That was in the article that was in the paper. So I was thrilled at being able to do that. And we can get into that in a second as to why, but just to follow up, there were changing perspectives in planning occurring at the time. Planning up until let's say the 50s and getting into the 60s was basically physical doers. So you had people saying, "Here's my prescription for your municipality. We've looked at all the data and we think you should do this, this, and this." And they were engineers, architects, and landscape planners. A lot of the stuff was the grand visions. We're going to have a grand boulevard here, the municipal hall is going to be in this location, and the other things are going to happen, and the industry is not going to be in the same place as residential. Those types of discussions took place. When I went into university for the planning, they were switching over, and so I went to the University of Toronto for planning. And they were looking for people. I didn't even know, I'll get into the next thing, but interdisciplinary things where you're trying to get people together to make decisions about what's affecting their lives, it became far more collaborative. The other thing is going from product to what I'll call here is consensus, but basically that's the collaboration. You were trying to get out into the community organizing to try to figure out what people thought the issues were and what things could be done about those issues. And the exciting times were happening particularly in Toronto and Vancouver, for Canada, that is. When I was out here, you would also get a job quite easily in Alberta, because Alberta had all the growing stuff that was happening with the oil industry, and the cities, Edmonton and Calgary, were going quickly. They needed planners. So when I graduated from planning, there was something like 900 planners, you know, in Canada. There was in the early periods, and then there were thousands afterwards. So I was in at exactly the right moment in order to get into planning. So what the trends were at that time, and then I'll get back to West Vancouver in a second, is that I learned that I didn't have to be an architect and I didn't have to be a landscape architect. That I could actually become a planner without any taste or practical skills whatsoever. So, and particularly things like the taste. I wanted to be an architect at one time, and I couldn't even draw a square. Even if I had a ruler, I couldn't draw a square. It looked like a bad square. So I knew I was out of it that time, but when I got into the community organizing, I realized that there were actually some talents I could bring to the job, and what they were looking for were people that came from all sorts of different directions. So when I said I was graduated in business, they said, no one else from business is applying for the planning school. We'd love to have you come. And so there was community activism going on, which that's what the planning model was. There are changing models of local governments. So if you were in Vancouver or Toronto at that time, you'd find your office was not in Municipal Hall. Your office as a neighborhood planner was out in the neighborhood. There were one or two of you in the office, and it was your job to organize the neighborhood, to put together committees, to analyze what was happening and what was necessary in those communities. The reduction in the visionary plans, we were not creating visions of Toronto. My first neighborhood in Toronto was an area called South of Carleton. I was not creating a vision for South of Carleton. South of Carleton was in the Skid Row area, had a lot of problems, a lot of poor people. Rooming houses was the entire place. There were a lot of whitewashing coming in, people coming in, buying the houses, fixing them up. There were a lot of problems there, and you had to try to figure out what the solutions were. When I was first starting off, the people that were involved there in Toronto were John Sewell, who was the alderman in the area I was working with, David Crombie, of course, who was the mayor at the time. By the way, Pam, at that time, the staff were allowed to go out and knock on door to door to get people elected. I was in favor of David Crombie at the time, so you would never, ever get to do that nowadays. Out here, you had people like Ray Spaxman, Art Phillips, and Michael Harcourt involved in those same types of things out here. I went to one of my first neighborhood meetings. Just imagine a neighborhood meeting here in West Vancouver, but this was in the downtown Toronto, middle of Skid Row, and they asked, John Sewell said, I want you to come and speak on what we can do about housing in this area. And I did a whole bunch of study, made a preparation, all did speeches and stuff, went and made the speech. And at the end of it, this is a different community than the one in West Vancouver. At the end of it, there was a bit of a silence. And John Sewell said, bullshit. And I was 27 years old, you know, and I thought it was pretty good. It took me weeks to prepare it. But I was giving prescriptions of what people said you could do for housing. And he said, that's not true. He said that there's all sorts of things you can do. You just haven't thought of them yet. And so that was my big lesson in planning, because that same year, I heard what he was saying. I paid attention to it. That's a bigger thing, but I paid attention to what he was saying. I had the background in real estate, And there was a person there that assembled an entire block of heritage homes. They were the big mansions of Toronto. It was an entire block, and it was filled with rooming house people. And I looked at it, and the developer was Fred Breda, and he was going to knock them all down and build high-rises. And we approached him. It was not necessarily a friendly approach. It was a partly friendly approach, but it was a big thing with community organizing. What we ended up with there is the municipality through the province. We put this all together as part of the local area planning process. The province and the municipality acquired the block. They designed a project that kept all of the heritage buildings there, converted them to apartments, and put in the backyards of those, basically apartments up to about 4 stories high, containing the mini units, plus some of the main ones, so the people that were in the rooming houses could move back into these mini apartments. And it's still there today, and it's subsidized. And that's one thing where you say, I didn't even think of that as an option until I thought about it as an option. And there's a big jump in that. So that was my learning. That was the start of my learning for planning. So it gets up to the point, say, okay, now I come out to Vancouver, and I meet West Vancouver, and I thought, this is something else, you know. Here's a community that's got a whole bunch of things which I never thought people could get to enjoy in their lives. Like it was incredible to me, and it comes on the next slide a little bit. But there were these phases. These are the phases I picked out in West Vancouver. One was 1912. There was 1,500 people in West Vancouver. And by the time it got up to the 1945, that entire period, that's the time, by the way, when British Pacific Properties buys the land up above the Upper Levels Highway, puts in the Lionsgate Bridge. There's a whole bunch of things happening there, but basically for West Vancouver, it splits off from North Vancouver in 1912. It has 1,500 people, and it grows a little bit up to 1945. In 1945 to 1960, 1945, I was -1 year old. So 1945 to 1960 was family creation. There was a lot of subdivision taking place, a lot of houses being built. It was an expansion area. The area was growing. 1960 to 1980, at the end of 1950, Bill Patterson puts out a plan saying, I think basically it's about time that you had an apartment core in West Vancouver of apartments. Ambleside needs it commercially, and people that are growing up and you expect them to need housing in the later, they need that apartment housing. So he recommended, it became a 50-acre apartment zone. He recommended 100 acres. He recommended that the apartment zone go from Park Royal out to Dunderave. The municipal council said, we'll keep it at 50 acres and put it in a little bit more together down there. 1980 to 2000 was managing change. Well, why do I say managing change? Because in 1971, when they were just getting into, Rod was involved in doing some planning work, but as a resident at the time. Council was getting into the point where they were starting to be doing the work to create the 1980 community plan. That's the one I came in at. The biggest threat to the municipality was it said in the plan, was rampant growth, uncontrolled growth, okay, in West Vancouver. And they wrote the plan for that. And Louise Spratley wrote the plan, and it's the granddaughter? Daughter-in-law of Louise Spratley's at the meeting tonight, but Louise Spratley wrote the plan that the technicians basically created for that. And it was all on trying to maintain the status quo. So my first job coming in was how to stop the high rises. Toronto had a thing where they put a 45 limit on the downtown. This was how to stop the high rises. I wrote a whole bunch of stuff. I spent about a year and a half on it. It was rejected by council. And the reason council rejected it, they said, well, there's only 7 to 12 or something sites left in the entire area. It's too much. You can't do that. So that was managing change. What happened though, growth stopped in 1971. So people were talking about rampant growth even when there was no growth. So in 1971, it was about 38,000, 37,000 people. In 1980, when the plan was adopted, it was still the same number of people. It was up about 1,000. And basically, by the time it gets up to today, it's at 43,000, dropping a little bit. But it was not that long ago when it was a little bit less than that. So for 50 years, West Vancouver has not been something which is growth in terms of population. The change is occurring though. Change is occurring. So from 2000 onwards, we've been always talking about change, what kind of change, what can we manage and change, what can make West Vancouver better than it is now without changing the overall character of West Vancouver that we bought here in the first place and we moved into in the first place. What made West Vancouver special, and I'll just do this one really quickly, is obviously the setting. You know, it's got the mountains on the upside, it's got the water on the downside, it's got beautiful creeks flowing through it, it's got forest areas all over, it's got a huge amount of parkland. That's caused by people, basically, some of the fathers of West Vancouver and the mothers of West Vancouver in terms of the councils. It has a talented community. And I'll get to that a little bit later, but it has a talented community that had a will to create a place of excellence. I picked the word place of excellence because it was one of the things that Derek Humphreys kept on saying all the time, that the mayor, Derek Humphreys, kept on saying it's a place of excellence, a place of excellence. He also kept on saying to people coming up to the microphone at council, keep your comments succulent. which the staff never brought to his attention. So there were some things that Mayor Goldsmith-Jones, no, you didn't actually say anything like that, Pam, so don't do it. There were a series of exceptional councils. If you looked at the steps that were taken by the councils of West Vancouver from 1912 onwards, it is really amazing sometimes how visionary they were in terms of some of their decisions. So, and my biggest experience coming out here originally was how civilized it was to be at a council meeting, where actually discussions took place even when there were disagreements, until I had a meeting on Horseshoe Bay. So, anyway, then there was a dedicated and there was an innovative staff at the time. There was actually I really enjoyed working in West Vancouver because the staff I worked with were really fun to be with, and they were very smart. So there was basically a powerful sense of pride, with some willingness to face risk. West Vancouver, I always thought West Vancouver was the place people moved because they couldn't afford to live in the west side of Vancouver. I thought people moved over here because it was affordable at the time, and they moved over here for that reason. I then read a study by Oberlander and Robinson, 1951, and it said, this was in 1951, they said, West Vancouver's a place, an elite group of citizens in terms of occupation, incomes, and education, occupations, and income. So it was always kind of an elite not everybody was elite, because obviously I moved here, but it was an elite group of people, and they were willing to face some risks. So when West Vancouver was formed, they had something like that. When they moved off of North Vancouver, they took over $150,000 worth of debt to separate from North Vancouver. And then they took on another $500,000 to create the services that they thought the community needed. That was a big risk at the time in 1912. So there was a single owner of a substantial amount of land, which enabled West Vancouver to negotiate with one company for a lot of things that it accomplished in the times to come. It was a big, if you looked at working in a place like Surrey or Delta or Vancouver, where you're trying to put together pieces of land that were owned by multiple companies, good luck in trying to do that. But when you're able to negotiate with one company, it gives you a lot of leverage in terms of doing that. And so the question came up on that, and it was just a question that occurred to me. So I'll write it down. I said, how did West Vancouver, a residential community with limited tax resources, because it has no commercial and industrial base, or hardly any of industrial, manage to inherit a corridor community with astounding natural beauty and manage not to ruin it? You know, and it's a serious question to ask, because there's any number of decisions that could have been made to lead to results which were not what you see today. The four things that I see, or the five things that four things basically, but the five includes the early history, setting the stage. The process of planning that West Vancouver used, its tendency, its strong tendency to nurture a sense of community, the character of the community, its use of land for planning, which I find to be somewhat unique, and the honoring of our strengths, mainly the natural assets, the creeks, terrains, and the people we have. The early history, as I've mentioned before, is that the big decisions were limiting commercial to pockets, not allowing the industrial. We owned all of these things, schools, police, the transit. It's a rural community. People consider it rural, park-like, but it's highly serviced. We had an apartment zone created. We have access to the sea, and we have significant parks throughout it. Those were basically the assets we were playing around with. The process of planning in West Vancouver is, West Vancouver, when I came here, had standing committees on almost every subject you can think of to do with the municipality. Every major action that has been taken in West Vancouver has involved a resident committee. As far as every major decision in West Vancouver is a result of collaboration and consultation with the community. That is not normal in most communities. It is possible in a community of 37,000 people, and it was a big plus. My most memorable ones, and I probably shouldn't even list them. Actually, I won't list them. All I can say is it would take a number of pages. If you go through the documents to say, here's the actions that have been taken by West Vancouver councils over the 30 years that I've been involved here, they would fill up pages of things. The power of such planning, that's the collaboration with the community. The power of it is derived from basically it's the talent and the dedication of the people that are on those committees. And it's the trust and respect that the councils have shown to the advice they're being given by those committees. That's where the power of such planning is. The usefulness of those committees and the productivity, it's not planning by committee. The usefulness is they have diversity of people and opinions on the committee. If everyone in the committee thinks the same and they all agree, then it's a very short committee. You might as well just meet one day and then the next day write your report and go on. It's when you get into those heavy debates with people disagreeing with each other that you get the most dynamic and the most successful plans. But there are challenges with that. It takes a lot of staff and a lot of money to man those committees. And if the committees do not have that assistance, and they're forced into writing the reports and researching them themselves, as we are in the neighborhood committee to some extent, it takes a lot of work on that committee, and you depend on that committee having people of various backgrounds that can put together that package. So, and then the only other thing I find on committees is that you will find sometimes that the proposals coming out of committees, because they're so hard to debate these things, they define the problem, but they don't really define the solutions very well. And so you end up with something that everybody agrees that that's the problem, but you still don't know what to do about it. So the nurturing the sense of community, that comes in a lot of different things. I find in West Vancouver, there's perhaps a little bit less feeling of community sometimes today than there was in the more distant past. And there are reasons for that. But the nurturing, everything council has done most of the time. Heritage policy, for example, is fairly obvious. You're trying to nurture what's the history of West Vancouver. There were policies developed, there were inventories made. We dealt with the dedication, the designation of the lower Caulfield area to control some of the things happening there, because we could define the character fairly strongly down there. And there's recently anyways, there's been some larger estate type lots that have had beautiful homes on them that were basically important heritage-wise. And certain types of developments have taken place, infill types of developments, and they seem to be fitting in. That wouldn't have happened prior to probably 90. But it is happening now, and those examples will help us to judge whether they're worthwhile. The community trail connections. West Vancouver is amazing in terms of anything that happens in West Vancouver. You create a park, you create a subdivision, you create a master plan. It always has trail connections throughout the various parts in West Vancouver. And if you're a local, you know where those trail connections are normally, and you can go from one area to another. You might walk up 700 feet, but hopefully some of the trails go across. Caulfield Village Center. It's an interesting little story, and it doesn't seem like it, but I live out at Whitecliff, and I've lived out there for 34 years. And always tried to figure out how we could turn Horseshoe Bay into kind of like a community center, which it is now. It's a community village, I would say. But it's really also a tourist destination in terms of the ferries, people going out. If you look at the commercial in Horseshoe Bay, you can't build a grocery store down there, a large one, because you've only got one road in and one road out, basically. And so we were trying to figure out what to do about that. And before I came, at any rate, Caulfield Plateau's land use contract was created, and there was a piece of land owned by BPP at the time, which was not built by BPP, but it was owned by BPP. And it was designated as basically a Western center, a commercial center. And some people out in the area said, well, that meant a gas station and a convenience store. But that wasn't really the intent of it. So another company bought it and tried to put in a commercial center, which would act as that. And we went through, the council and staff went through a big battle on that. And there was stuff going out to every household saying mega mall. It's going to destroy the neighborhood. It was finally approved by council. It was a long time. The architect was so frustrated with one of the design panels that he crashed his motorcycle up on the Sea to Sky Highway at 80 miles per hour and said, I'm never going to ride a motorcycle again. He probably never came to the design panel again either, but he basically, the developer created this. It was successful. And we were taken to the Supreme Court. Challenged. The decision was challenged of council. And the Supreme Court agreed with council, so it went ahead. The next year, I was called by the person who was the chair of the opposition group. And he said, I felt I had to call you to let you know that we're really glad we lost. So, and that's our neighborhood go-to. So all of the people that were going and doing certain things, whether it was a dentist, drugstore, all those types of things, grocery, do not have to drive through somebody else's neighborhood. And they can say, this is my place and it's only a 10-minute drive. If that wasn't out there right now, you would have a different sense. That same creation happened when we put in the Glen Eagles Recreation Center. And we were trying to put the Recreation Center, by the way, on the school site at the back where the forest is. We could not come to an agreement with the school board on it. So we eventually put it out at Glen Eagles, but it would have created a larger center of why people would be in that location. The cutting edge regulation of neighborhood character, I'm on a group now dealing with neighborhood character. And one of the first things I did in the group was said, you know that this has been going on for 40 years now. So, and it's not just been done, like it's been done 4 different times in 40 years. And we still haven't solved all the problems, but he said, if you didn't know what had gone on in the last 40 years, you could see how badly it could have turned out. So there's a cutting edge regulations. West Vancouver was the first community that I'm aware of that had a floor area control on the single family zones. It had things like different types of ways you measured height, all sorts of different things, the boulevard areas. There was neighborhood characters in terms of the boulevards, which will come up later on, but there was a ton of things that were done. And we're still working on now in terms of and that report will be coming out this coming year, but we're still working out what more we can do. The creation of 3 mixed-use villages. West Vancouver had these commercial villages going around. So we had Ambleside, Dunderave, Horseshoe Bay, those 3 basically, Caulfield being a little bit different. And I'm leaving out Park Royal. I don't consider that a commercial village of anything. Even the village at Park Royal, I don't consider a village. It's a great addition for the shopping center. It's not a village. For me, anyways, it's not a village. So the 3 mixed-use villages, when I came in 1980, those areas were all limited to commercial. And there was a change in zoning proposed for Dunderave, which said we could change some of the land on Bellevue and on Haywood to commercial, and nothing happened. And the developers came in and said, we really need to create something which is a mixed use with residential. And council eventually agreed with that. And when they agreed with it, if you notice, all of a sudden, Dunderave went completely mixed use on Haywood and on Bellevue. It went big mixed use on Bellevue in Vancouver and Clyde Avenue and those places. And even in Horseshoe Bay, projects coming out were mixed use. There was a huge demand for the residential in commercial areas, which was not being satisfied by one apartment zone. To me, those areas now are more of a village. And I'll show you my disappointments on my last slide, but are more of a village than they were at that time. And then the boulevards rolled. We own most of the roads in West Vancouver, the old West Vancouver, are 66 feet wide, and there's 20 feet of pavement. The rest is public. Those public areas make a big difference in terms of the neighborhood characters and what happens on them. And we're looking at that more now. But policies were created specifically for that by the West Vancouver Council. This is the Caulfield Village Center. The one thing you'll notice on that, with discussions with the local neighbors, is that there was a whole bunch of variations, but this one is basically a U. We looked at trying to make it more of a shopping street, but it's a U. There are no windows on the back, so the people on the back and the residential were not affected. You're not even allowed to have a restaurant with a window looking out the back. And that was part of the negotiations with the local community to make sure that these things could coexist. The way it is today. This is just an example when I mentioned that when this thing switched from just commercial, nobody was building anything, to mixed use commercial, all of a sudden all of Bellevue went mixed commercial residential. The big thing, I think, for a municipality the size of West Vancouver, 36,000 people, this is actually a very big part of what's happened with West Vancouver and why it is today. West Vancouver was the first, it'll still be the only, but it was the first community to take over control of the foreshore, 1,000 feet out from the waterfront. And so we have control over what happens in that area, or at least we had control, we have control. And that's why it's remained natural a lot. We also get revenues from it, but it's a control of basically the water, because it's a major asset. The Seawalk lands, Seawalk being the one in Ambleside, or the Seawalk, I mean, being the one out at Glen Eagles. Seawalk is the one in Ambleside. That is a pathway that goes all the way from the Capilano Canyon out to Dunderave. It was organized, property was negotiated privately. We bought private properties all the way along it with the BC Rail to get permission for that, with private owners along the area. We bought the first 6 inches of land out in Dunderave in order to control the waterfront, all the way along that. And it was basically Don Lanscale was the leader of the one for the original Centennial Seawalk. But that's a fantastic accomplishment and fairly expensive one nowadays for the West Vancouver. And then Ambleside, we bought and integrated the properties along that. We own practically all of Ambleside now. The Seaview Walk at Glen Eagles, BC Rail happened to have Peter Martin and Jim Cox were in charge of BC Rail lands at the time. And they were willing to negotiate. So we negotiated for that, and we acquired 1.2 miles basically of land along there for free. We didn't have to pay for it. And that's now owned by the municipality as a Seaview Walk. We also determined where development could take place. And when we couldn't put the Western Rec Center in the Caulfield area, we bought those lands and we moved Marine Drive out and put in the Western Rec Center in that location, and put in the fire hall in that location, expanded the golf course. The seniors housing, you're probably not aware, not many of them anyways, the municipality assembled all of the land across from the library, just next block over from the library, the 22,000 block. And that's Hollyburn House now, but that was a municipal assembly. I remember, because of the last property we acquired there, before we acquired it, we had to demolish some of the houses because they were vacant at the time. And we got a call on the phone. Apparently the guy in the remaining house was out shopping and got back, and we'd already taken out his bathroom. So our crews did not realize that we hadn't acquired that house. So he was willing to sell, but not quite at that time. So Ambleview Place, the co-op that's over at 14th Street, that was a municipal land assembly. And we put together a co-op that could sell the land, sell the units in the co-op at less than market value, and it's still going today, successfully. Dave and Karen are maybe in the room, or at least they were, but they live there, and she's one of the people handling the sales. A lot of the Kiwanis is on land assembled by the municipality. The westerly down here is on land assembled by the municipality. And there were a number of other developments over here which were rezoned by the municipality, but the actual acquisition took place. The works yard at 320 Taylor Way, where the 2 twin towers are now, and those buildings are 60 feet away to 100 feet away from the roadways. We own that as a works yard. We picked up the car dealership there, went through about 10 years of back and forth with developers, and finally sold it to developers for that project. The money from that project basically paid for, or helped pay for, the reconstruction of the recreation center here, the construction of the rec center out at Horseshoe Bay and Glen Eagles, And some of the land assemblies around here that are now seniors housing. And it went into the Heritage Fund. Those are seniors, Ambleview and the main rec center, the Kiwanis, Seaview Walk, and Glen Eagles. None of those would have been possible with the manipulation of the value of that 320 Taylor Way. Honoring our strengths, and I don't need to go into that, but our strengths physically are in the natural environment. It's called, in most plans in the past, it was called the Park-like community. There's a lot of reference to being designed with nature, those types of things. But the trees, the creeks, the drainage and blast and rock removal, which I'll describe in a second, mandatory development permits, which allowed us to control all of the development above the highway and actually negotiate things which a developer, you wouldn't be able to achieve it in other circumstances. So the mandatory development permits with a single developer allowed us to create a lot of the open spaces. The 1,200-foot development restriction, open public waterfront access. So we have access every 200 meters along the waterfront in West Vancouver. It's not just access, which shows on a map, it's actually open access in almost all situations. There was an obelisk program where we put obelisks at all the entrances to the waterfront, only to find late at night, those things tend to disappear and probably end up in the rec room of some of the neighbors of the obelisks. But at any rate, the last things that happened, more recent things, is that neighbors of those being concerned about their privacy would actually pay for the landscaping of the access to those waterfront places so that they actually become a beautiful area that are private to the adjacent owners but go down to the waterfront. Kevin Pike's been involved in a number of those. So and then securing extensive sections of forest. When we were doing part of this thing, the upper lands, this kind of displays, the upper lands displays what I've been talking about for this entire evening right now. The upper land studies and policies were always involved residents of the community in developing the policies. They were so difficult and so complex that the staff got heavily involved and outside consultants in trying to put together these things. And it was still going on under Bob Sokol after I left. But at any rate, it's really worked out fairly well in terms of what's been achieved. So the innovations up there are things like, the biggest one, I think anyways, is the transfer of density that's happened. The transfer of density is a thing. It's not called transfer of density because that was a bad word. Density was a very bad word to use in West Vancouver. So you call it area density variation. That was okay. That was okay. The first examples of that were opposed, even though they were in the plan, they were opposed. They were not done on British properties lands. They were built on, one of them might have been associated, but they were done on Panorama Drive and on Deer Ridge. And the result was very little footprint and a ton of open space. What happened in addition, this area density variation, this is where you take land that was previously developed all for large homes, large lots, and you would develop some of it and then do other things with the other part. The other things, I remember the first one of the first ones we did with Deer Ridge, and all of the areas below the highway out by Glen Eagles that go along that Seaview Walk, all natural areas, they were taken by the municipality. So the municipality owns them now. And I remember some of the neighbors or some of the residents in West Vancouver said, well, nobody would ever develop those anyways. They wouldn't develop them, so they would have remained undeveloped otherwise. That was before lands were selling at $4 to $5 million. Now people would build on anything. So now instead of being something which would never be developed, now that's an example of, well, that was a good idea. Now it's never going to be developed, that part. So we had that happen. We acquired land for schools, which you'll find in other municipalities, you don't have the means of doing that. We could do it because we could negotiate on large stretches. It lands the works yard for the school that's up on the Cypress Bowl Road. That was acquired through transfer of density. The playing fields that are under construction right now across the works yard, that's done through transfer of density. All of the lands going through the Rogers Creek area, over 55% of the lands there are remaining green. It's green forest. That was done through transfer of density. All of those things were done through a program developed by council, which was before 1980, none of it would have been done. I was here when the first example of one, a townhouse development, had just gone through a process trying to be approved over by West Hill. And council at the time, it was too difficult to get it approved in the community, turned it down. And British Properties at the time, the chairman of it said, that's the last time we'll ever do that. He's no longer the chairman, but the British Properties do that now, and they do it. It's not because they're doing it out of the goodness of their heart. The market changed. Big houses, big lots don't sell necessarily as well as a variety of products. But they would not have been approved by the council until it saw examples of things that seemed to be working out. So the lessons I've learned, this is the second last slide, by the way, for those of you that need a bathroom break. Some lessons in planning over 35 years. To me, it's scary to talk about long-term plans. You know, there was one place, all this time this was going on, by the way, West Vancouver was part of the GVRD, so we're doing all this. Other municipalities are doing certain things, but there's certain targets in terms of the livable region that we are trying to achieve. The long-term plans the GVRD was working up once had a projection for a 100-year projection for sewers. And it is frightening when you get a 100-year projection. Like you've got something where the populations are so out of whack with what you see yourself that you can't stand it. So you stay with, basically when you're planning, you try to stay with something like 20 to 30-year maximum projections of what's happening. But even then, if you'd propose something long-term and it's a change, its chances of success are really, really 50-50 a lot of times, because people want to see what the result is before you've done it. You see? That's natural. I'm the same way. So they can be really politically unpopular until they're proven. So when you get a possibility of testing it out, a possibility of showing it being done, it's really a lot. You can say, did you like that? Did it work out okay? The second one is listening. Listening is a really powerful tool. You know, when you're in the example of that is when you look at committees doing work and planning, you tend to think, well, committee decisions are worse than an individual who really knows what they're talking about. I found that if you've got a committee arguing with each other about what's the best route to take, and you're able to listen to what they're saying, then the possibilities of a better solution actually go up. And so I really like the idea, but you have to be able to listen and understand what the other people are saying. So one example of that is the thing to doing with blasting and rock removal. In West Vancouver, and this would be, Bill Chapman could help me probably on that. I think it was probably back at the end of the 80s, end of the 80s, when there was a SAFE committee made up of various members of the community. It was to deal with basically people blasting away rock faces in order to build houses, moving the mountains. It was called, I call it heroic measures in order to do development, just subdivision and houses. And so the committee was set up, and it was made up of people that were against rock removal and blasting, and other people that were builders, and other people that were just normal residents. And they couldn't agree on what the solutions should be to that or even necessarily agree at that time on what the real problem was. So I said, well, let's first of all see if we can agree on the problem. And we worked through that, discussed it. I wrote it all out in terms of a thing. And they said, yeah, we can all agree. And this were people that had a really big differences of opinion. But for different reasons, they could agree that that was a problem. They just couldn't agree on the solution. Then the next step was, well, if you can't agree on the solution, we'll write up a solution. And you can debate the solutions and see if you can come to an agreement on it. And for some reason, when the package came together, they said, we're willing to compromise. If you agree to it, I can agree to it. That's it. And so we actually got bylaws limiting the amount of rock that could be taken out, the amount of how to do the blasting, and limits are very, very severe. And the process is very, very severe to do that. And so that to me was an example of something where you just say, you can accomplish things in here, even if there's disagreement, major disagreement on doing it. And then the third thing on that, which I've learned is sometimes painfully, is that whether you're successful or not, or whether you make progress or not, often depends on if you know when to push and when not to push. If you're pushing too many times at the same time, there's great resistance to it. But if you can pick the things that you think are the most important and push on those, you tend to be successful. The staff can help a community visualize and realize its dreams. But my experience is that communities in West Vancouver and everywhere, there's no such thing as a shared dream. Okay? It's sort of like, if everybody's lying in the same bed, do you have the same nightmares, whatever the case may be. But so if there are multiple dreams in a community, then you have to pay attention. You said, whose dream am I actually pushing here? And try to come to an understanding of what that is. And then the other thing is, dedication is infectious. What I found in every single thing in West Vancouver, where there's been a really tough project to do, I almost always find that there's a leader. This would be a leader not necessarily on staff, it's usually on council. There's a leader who's got a passion for it and a dedication to get it done. And they can take a project a long way towards completion with the assistance of staff. If no one on council cares, it's not going to get done. So the low points, it's hard to figure out what the low points are. There's so many, just actually there are not so many. But there's some big ones. The low points for me is the high price the high price of land in West Vancouver. I've never been able to figure out the solution to it, but it's a low point when I see the amount of exclusion that's involved in that. You can ameliorate it by having different sizes of residential units so that some come in at a lower cost than others. And you can recognize that just because you're living in West Vancouver doesn't necessarily mean that your child can live in West Vancouver right now. They may have to live somewhere else or on the outskirts. But nowadays there are no outskirts. And West Vancouver's prices are atrociously high in a lot of cases. In terms of what we saw before, when I moved into West Vancouver, I could not afford to live in Ambleside. I could afford to live in Whitecliff. Okay? I could not afford to live in Whitecliff now. So the same thing with commercial. The rents, in terms of what people charge or are asking for new, especially when a new building gets built, but in terms of the older buildings and everything else, the variety of commercial, of retail in Ambleside particularly is diminished compared to what it was in the past. So the things like the garden shops go up for development, and then somebody comes in and it's office buildings and service buildings and those types of things. So you lose some of that feel. It's still, that feel is still in Dunderave as a village, and it's probably going to be, hopefully, still in places like Edgemont, but in other places it's a struggle. It's a real struggle. Businesses struggle to remain in West Vancouver or in Vancouver. The upper lands, to me, has not achieved a sense of place. The upper levels is a place with views, and it's difficult to get to in terms of any access by transit, and it's expensive. So hopefully we'll be able to figure that out. I know that the current staff and the council are struggling with what to do and whether they can solve it through the Cypress Village type of thing. It may be possible to do that. Ambleside Village is not a unique waterfront showcase. It's got a great waterfront. It's got a great waterfront walk. You can go down there and you can have a bite to eat somewhere, not on the waterfront, mind you, but you can go down into Ambleside. But in terms of realizing what the potential is in terms of putting it all together, you still have to walk across the tracks back and forth to get to it. So it's not magic, that's for sure. And then the silo thinking still occurs. What I had not mentioned before was when the organization of West Vancouver combined all sorts of different departments, and you never knew when you were working for when I became the senior planner in West Vancouver, Bob Collier was the director of planning, I was the senior planner, Barbara Reed was the social planner. Next door to me was Heinz Berger, was the parks manager. Frank Carouse. I was in the department of planning, development, buildings, parks, and recreation. And we had meetings. We only had to have meetings then with engineering and finance. So the only ones left in the thing. So everything was, there were not the silos. The debates were always happening that way. When you get more complex, the silos are created. So you lose touch. If I do this decision, how much is it going to cost me? What am I going to lose in some other thing that the municipality needs? That's the type of thing you lose. What am I proudest of? I am really proud of what we did in terms of all the whole stuff to do with land acquisition, use, and sale. I think it's fantastic in West Vancouver. The Seaview Walk out in the Western Community Center, out in the west. Caulfield Village, I'm really, really glad it was approved by the council, and that was a tough decision for council to make. The upper lands change in vision from big houses on big lots to something much more diverse than that. Built-in nature to a larger extent with a lot more protection of the creeks. I'm really proud of the dedication of staff. As Rod said, at one point there was so much work going on, and I don't know whether anybody realized, but the planning staff at that time, and a lot of other staff, but the planning staff, there was no overtime. So when you saw planning staff here in the evenings, they were here on their own time. And when you saw them doing things on the weekends, that was on their own time. And the dedication of that staff is just, to me, it was astounding. Most of us do not save the world, but I find it a better place because of the people I've met and worked with in West Vancouver. So that's what I'm proud of. And I am actually proud of being a participant in the history of West Vancouver too. So thank you very much.